The heat had been sitting on the land for hours, pressing down on the dry riverbed and the brittle grass around it, flattening every sound until even the insects seemed careful with their wings. Nothing moved except the slow drifting of dust in the air. From a distance, the lion looked like part of the earth itself, his tawny body stretched along the cracked mud, ribs barely rising beneath his skin. He did not lift his head when shadows shifted nearby. He did not flick his tail at the flies gathering along his flank. Only the uneven movement of his chest, shallow and irregular, marked the thin line between presence and absence. One paw trembled faintly against the ground, a small involuntary motion that seemed to fade as soon as it appeared. Each breath came with a low rasp, dry and fragile, as if his lungs were pulling air through sand. The conservation worker noticed the stillness before he noticed the lion. It was the way the birds kept their distance, how the usual patterns of movement along the riverbed had quietly dissolved. Years in the field had taught him that imbalance announced itself long before it became visible. He slowed his steps instinctively, boots barely disturbing the dust, body angled sideways in a posture of respect rather than intrusion. From where he stood, he could see the animal's eyes half open, dulled by exhaustion and dehydration, unfocused on anything beyond the next breath. Flies clustered near the corners of his mouth and along his ears, testing boundaries that were no longer defended. The lion's sides lifted unevenly, one breath deeper than the next, as though his body could no longer agree on how to stay alive. The man crouched several meters away, careful not to collapse the fragile calm that had settled around the animal. He rested his hands on his knees and waited, allowing his presence to be absorbed into the landscape rather than imposed upon it. The lion responded only with a faint tightening of his jaw and a barely audible exhale. His muscles, once shaped by years of hunting and territory, now lay slack beneath stretched skin. His mane, dulled by dust and sunlight, hung in tangled strands along his neck. When a light breeze passed through, it stirred the grass and brushed softly across his face, and his eyelids fluttered in weak reflex before settling again. "Easy, boy," the worker murmured once, barely louder than the wind. The words meant more for rhythm than reassurance. Time moved strangely in that space between breaths. Each minute felt heavy, weighted by uncertainty. The lion's paw twitched again, then fell still. His nostrils flared briefly, drawing in air that seemed thinner with every attempt. Somewhere in the distance, a herd shifted, hooves scuffing against dry soil, their movement faint and indifferent. Above them, the sun edged lower, pulling long shadows across the riverbed. As light softened and heat loosened its grip, the man remained where he was, watching, waiting, measuring hope in the quiet rise and fall of a tired chest, while the wind whispered through grass that bent and straightened in slow, patient rhythm. The afternoon stretched outward without clear edges, blurring into itself as heat and silence layered over the riverbed. The man did not move from his place. He shifted only when necessary, adjusting his posture slowly so the dust would not rise, so the fragile balance around the lion would remain undisturbed. He unfolded a small canvas sheet and angled it carefully to cast a narrow band of shade across the animal's head and shoulders, watching how the shadow slid across fur and skin. Then he placed a shallow container of water just within reach, close enough to be noticed, far enough to avoid pressure. Nothing about the gesture demanded response. It was simply an offering left in stillness. The lion remained mostly unchanged. His body stayed heavy against the earth, weight surrendered to the cracked ground beneath him. His breathing continued in shallow, uneven waves, sometimes slowing until it seemed to disappear, then returning in faint, stubborn pulses. Occasionally, one ear twitched, a small reflexive movement in response to flies or distant sounds. His tail shifted once, barely lifting before settling again. When the wind brushed across his face, his nostrils flared weakly, testing the air, registering the presence of water, fabric, and human scent without yet deciding what it meant. His eyes opened slightly at intervals, revealing dull amber beneath half-lowered lids, then closed again as fatigue reclaimed them. The man watched without staring. He learned the rhythm of the lion's breathing, the subtle pauses between each rise of the chest. He noticed how the muscles around the animal's jaw tightened when thirst pressed harder, how the tongue shifted briefly against dry gums before retreating. At one point, he leaned forward just enough to slide the water container a few centimeters closer, his movement slow enough to be almost imperceptible. The lion's ears angled back for a moment, tension flickering through his body like a weak current, then easing when no further approach followed. "It's okay," the man whispered softly, more breath than sound, and returned to stillness. Hours passed in this quiet negotiation. Sunlight drifted across the sky, changing color and weight, softening from sharp white to pale gold. The shade widened, cooling small sections of the lion's body. His breathing steadied slightly, no longer stuttering as often between breaths. Once, he lifted his head a few centimeters, a trembling effort that failed halfway, but ended with his muzzle resting closer to the water. His tongue touched the surface briefly, breaking it with the lightest ripple before withdrawing again. It was not yet drinking, not fully trusting, but it was no longer turning away. The man remained patient. He did not reach out. He did not close the distance. He allowed time to do what hands could not. Trust grew quietly in that shared stillness, shaped by absence of threat rather than presence of comfort. As shadows lengthened and insects softened their hum, the lion lay suspended between strength and collapse, breathing slowly beside the offered water, while the land held them both in a fragile, waiting calm. The following hours unfolded with careful coordination, shaped by restraint as much as urgency. The man did not act alone. A small veterinary team arrived quietly, their vehicle stopping far enough away to preserve the fragile calm that had taken root beside the riverbed. Doors closed softly. Voices stayed low. Movements were measured and deliberate, guided by long experience with animals balanced on the edge between resistance and surrender. They approached in a slow arc, never directly, allowing their shapes to blend gradually into the landscape. The lion's ears lifted weakly at the sound of unfamiliar steps, and his head shifted a few centimeters before sinking back against the ground. A light sedative was prepared, its dose calculated with care for a body already weakened by thirst and infection. The dart was delivered with precision, barely disturbing the air. The lion flinched once, a reflexive tightening of muscle, then settled again as the medicine began its quiet work. His breathing remained shallow but grew more regular, no longer catching at random intervals. The rasp in his throat softened into a steadier rhythm. The tension that had lived for days in his shoulders and jaw slowly loosened, as though his body were remembering how rest was supposed to feel. With his movements subdued but awareness still present, the team worked efficiently. An intravenous line was placed, allowing clear fluid to move steadily into his bloodstream, restoring what weeks of drought had taken away. His skin, dry and tight moments before, began to regain subtle elasticity. When pressure was applied, it no longer held its shape for long. Nearby, another veterinarian knelt beside his injured leg. The wound was deep and swollen, edges darkened by infection and dust. It was flushed gently, debris washed away with warm solution, revealing raw tissue beneath. The lion's muscles tightened briefly in response, and a low sound vibrated in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a breath, but something between warning and endurance. "It's all right," one of them murmured softly, voice barely rising above the wind, while steady hands continued their work. Antibiotic treatment followed, then clean bandaging, wrapped with care to allow movement without reopening damage. Throughout it all, the lion remained largely still, his eyes half-lidded, blinking slowly as if testing the world again one fragment at a time. His ears rotated occasionally, tracking distant birds, the rustle of grass, the soft shifting of boots. As fluids replenished his body, subtle changes emerged. His chest began to rise more evenly. The pauses between breaths shortened. Color returned faintly to his gums. At one point, he gathered enough strength to lift his head, holding it suspended for several seconds before lowering it again with controlled effort. A soft, restrained growl vibrated in his throat, not in aggression but in awareness, a reminder that instinct still lived beneath exhaustion. When the main procedures were complete, the team withdrew a few steps, returning space to the animal. The man who had first found him remained seated nearby, visible but unthreatening. The lion's eyes opened more fully now, focusing briefly on the human figure. They held there, unblinking, neither fearful nor defiant. Just present. In that quiet exchange, stretched between breath and heartbeat, a fragile bridge formed, built not from dominance or rescue, but from patience, restraint, and the shared understanding of survival. The hours after treatment passed in a delicate balance between improvement and fragility. The lion remained resting near the riverbed, his body stretched along the cooling ground, bandaged leg positioned carefully to avoid pressure. Fluids continued to work quietly through his system, and the worst of the fever had begun to loosen its grip. Still, weakness lingered in every movement. When he shifted, it was slow and deliberate, guided by caution rather than confidence. His breathing, though steadier, remained shallow, as if each inhale were weighed before being accepted. Late in the afternoon, when the sun had softened and the air carried a faint promise of evening, a sound drifted across the plains. It was low at first, almost indistinguishable from wind moving through distant grass. Then it came again, clearer this time, carrying rhythm and intention. A distant call, followed by another. The man noticed the change before he fully understood it. The lion's ears lifted, rotating toward the horizon. His head rose a few centimeters, held there with visible effort. Muscles along his shoulders tightened, awakening from long hours of stillness. More voices joined the first, overlapping in soft, resonant waves. From the far edge of the grasslands, shapes began to emerge. One by one, members of the pride appeared, partially concealed by tall stems and drifting dust. They did not rush forward. They stopped at a distance, forming a loose line against the fading light. Their bodies were alert but restrained, tails low, heads raised, eyes fixed on the figure by the riverbed. They watched in silence, reading the scene with instincts shaped by generations of caution. The injured lion responded with a slow, trembling inhale. His chest expanded more fully than it had all day. A low sound formed deep in his throat, gathering strength as it rose. When he released it, the call was rough and broken, weakened by exhaustion, yet unmistakably his. It carried across the open ground, answering the voices that had summoned him. The sound drained what little energy he had left, and for a moment his head dipped, as if he might collapse again. Then, with visible effort, he shifted his weight. His front paws pressed into the soil. Muscles strained beneath thinning fur. The bandaged leg hesitated, testing the ground, then accepted a fraction of his weight. Slowly, unevenly, he pushed himself upward. His body trembled as he rose, swaying slightly before finding balance. Dust clung to his coat. His mane caught the evening light. He stood, unsteady but upright, facing the distant figures of his pride. A soft exhale escaped one of the veterinarians before she could stop it. The team instinctively stepped back, increasing the space around him, lowering their presence to nothing more than distant silhouettes. No one spoke. No one moved. The pride answered his call in return, their voices blending into a low chorus that rolled across the plains. A few members advanced cautiously, closing the distance by small increments. The injured lion remained standing, head lifted, eyes fixed on them, body held together by instinct and resolve. In that quiet convergence of family and survival, humans became invisible once more, witnesses to a reunion written in breath, movement, and the slow fading of daylight. The following days unfolded with steady, patient rhythm. Care continued quietly, guided by restraint and observation rather than intervention. Fluids were reduced as the lion regained strength. Medication was adjusted with caution. The bandaged leg healed gradually, swelling retreating, heat fading from damaged tissue. Each morning brought small improvements that could not be measured in numbers, only in movement and presence. He stood more easily. He shifted without hesitation. His breathing deepened, no longer burdened by strain. Hunger returned in gentle stages, marked by slow, deliberate feeding and long hours of rest beneath scattered shade. By the time the final evening arrived, the lion no longer lay pressed into the earth. He rested upright, forelegs folded neatly beneath him, head lifted toward the open plains. His coat had regained subtle sheen where dust no longer clung. His eyes followed the movements of his pride, who had remained nearby throughout his recovery, appearing and retreating with quiet vigilance. They kept respectful distance from the human presence, never approaching, never abandoning him. Their low calls passed back and forth at dawn and dusk, reinforcing bonds that had never truly broken. As the sun descended, washing the land in muted gold and copper, the veterinary team prepared to withdraw completely. Equipment was packed without sound. Tracks were brushed lightly where possible. Nothing was left that did not belong. The man stood apart from the group, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the lion in silence. There was no ceremony, no clear signal. The moment arrived simply because it was ready. The lion rose without struggle. His movements were slow but confident, guided by balance rather than effort. He placed his weight evenly across all four limbs, including the once injured leg, which now supported him without tremor. Dust lifted gently around his paws as he took his first step forward, then another. The pride responded immediately, closing in around him in loose formation. Some walked slightly ahead, others flanked him, their bodies forming a living corridor through the grass. He did not look back. They moved together toward the horizon, silhouettes stretching across the ground as light softened into blue and amber. Grass parted beneath their passage, then settled again. With each step, the lion's posture grew surer, his head lifting higher, his stride lengthening. The bandage, now loosened and frayed, brushed briefly against his leg before falling away unnoticed, left behind like a discarded memory. The man remained where he was, long after they had blended into distance. He watched until individual forms became shadows, and shadows became movement, and movement became absence. In his mind, he carried the quiet hours beside a fading breath, the subtle shifts of trust earned without force, the shared stillness that had asked nothing and offered everything. It was not a story he would speak often. It belonged more to the land than to him. As night approached, wind moved gently through tall grass, erasing footprints one by one. Dust settled back into cracks along the riverbed. Insects resumed their soft rhythm. Somewhere far away, a pride's low calls echoed faintly, then dissolved into darkness. The plains returned to themselves, holding the memory in silence, as if nothing extraordinary had ever passed through it all.